Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today for our AI for Good Global Summit session on AI at the intersection of species conservation and climate action. I'm Joanna Batstone, the director of the Monash Data Futures Institute here at Monash University, and I will be your moderator today. The Monash Data Futures Institute aims to foster transnational, interdisciplinary collaborations in the applications of AI and data science for social good. By bringing together leading cross-disciplinary expertise, international partnerships, and one of the largest cohorts of data science and AI researchers in Asia Pacific. Before we begin, since we are joining in person from Monash University's Clayton campus in Australia, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are gathered here today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I would also like to welcome all the people from around the world who are joining us online via the Summit's Neural Network AI for Good platform. Welcome. It's an absolute pleasure for us to host today's event with the ITU AI for Good Global Summit. Climate change is here and very real, and our planet's biodiversity is under threat. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, released in 2022, the scientific evidence strongly suggests that impacts on ecosystems, including changes in ecosystem structure, species range, and timing of seasonal life cycles, can be attributed to climate change. The risks for global warming indicate that severe and widespread impacts are expected for unique and threatened ecosystems and species. Today, we will try to answer the key question: can we harness artificial intelligence as a tool at the intersection of species conservation and climate change? We are joined today by our keynote speaker and a panel of experts across the disciplines of ecology, conservation, computer science, data science, and communications. To kick off today's proceedings, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Tanja Berger-Wolf. Professor Berger-Wolf is a professor of computer science engineering, electrical and computer engineering, and evolution, ecology, and organismal biology at The Ohio State University in the United States, where she's also the director of the Transnational Data Analytics Institute. As a computational ecologist, her research is at the unique intersection of computer science, wildlife biology, and social sciences. In today's keynote, Tanja will share her work on the Human-AI Partnership for Conservation. Tanja, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today, being part of this wonderful event. Thank you to the organizers and the ITU for hosting the series, and for the organizers of putting together a wonderful panel for discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. So with that, we've seen these reports about the threat of the biodiversity on the planet. We're in the middle of what is termed the sixth extinction we're losing species at an unprecedented rate. One of the most recent US reports shows that 1 million species out of about 9 million that are out there are facing extinction. The problem is that we don't actually know what we're losing and how fast. The International Unit for Conservation of Nature, Red List, which is the official international organization that tracks the biodiversity of the world, and it's called the biodiversity monitor of the world, today tracks about 160,000 species. And of those that it tracks, about 20,000, the official conservation status is data deficient, not endangered, not threatened, data deficient. That means that we have no idea how many there are, where they're going, where they are, and whether the population is increasing, decreasing, or stable, right? Another 60,000+, their population trends is unknown. And these are not obscure species. These are killer whales, orcas, right? Their conservation status is data deficient. Polar bears, the iconic conservation species, the population trend is unknown. If we don't have information about these species, what hope do we have for the other 9 million? And how do we get a clue? Where can we get more data to fill the data gap of biodiversity that has been identified as one of the urgent, pressing issues in saving the world's biodiversity? Well, images are the most abundant, readily available source of information about anything, from what we have for lunch, to what is in our backyard, to what is out in the safaris and the oceans of the world. These images are coming from scientific projects through cameras and automated trail cameras, camera traps, as well as autonomous vehicles underwater, on the ground, and in the air, and many people, ordinary people, just going on these safaris and whale watching tours and taking pictures in their backyard and posting them online and contributing to a variety of social media platforms. There are millions of images out there. Just one platform, the most widely used citizen science platform, iNaturalist, one platform has more than 120 million images of more than 400,000 species. And that's one of many sources. It's one of many sources that we can use as the images about the natural world. Well, okay, they're images, but can we do something about them? Recent development of artificial intelligence methods, machine learning, and computer vision has really advanced our ability to make sense of these images. There are pretty established methods today for detecting an object of interest in an image, localizing it, putting a bounding box around it, classifying which species of plants or animals or fungi this is, and even identifying individual animals, and even pose estimation. So fitting the stick figure, skeletal kind of looking thing into the shape of the animal, and even going further to environmental reconstruction. We're really starting to have the methodology to be able to make sense of the images and make that information useful for biologists and conservation managers. So to give you an example, we built a whole platform called Wildbook, which is a flagship project of the nonprofit WildMe, that can take all these millions of images coming from all this variety of sources, and using machine learning and computer vision approaches, find all the images that contain animals, find where the animals are in those pictures, put a bounding box around each one, including that baby elephant hiding behind its mom, and identified not only species, as in savanna elephant, humpback whale, Grevy's zebra, or hawksbill turtle, but down to individual animal, as in Zippy the zebra, and Joe the giraffe, and Terry the turtle, and Willie the whale.
Amount of photos. I wonder, how do they sort through them all and then identify individual animals? Each image is processed through a series of convolutional neural networks and matching algorithms. The first network determines whether there are any animals of interest, in this case, zebras. The next set of networks localize each animal in its own subregion and classify the species. At this point, background segmentation is performed on the subregion to generate a rough mask of the zebra. Once this is done, key points are extracted from the zebra and feature descriptors are built. These descriptors serve as a sort of fingerprint that can be compared for similarity against previously identified individual animals in a large database. The scores from this comparison allow the system to decide which animals are the most likely matches. When the match has high enough confidence, it's accepted immediately. Matches that have lower confidence are shown to a human expert, who then makes the final decision.
So this is a little sneak peek behind the walls of the methods. And we can identify any striped, spotted, wrinkled, notched species in the water or on the ground, including using the shape of a whale's fluke or the dorsal fin of a dolphin. The previous video described just one of the growing number of algorithms that we use for individual identification. And we currently have 7 in deployment, but this is an open source project. So anybody can contribute, and there are increasingly people who are developing their own approaches for individual ID that can be incorporated into the platform, which makes it a collaborative global effort. Together with the information on when and where the image was taken, we can now use images to track animals, count them, and even figure out their social network. And yes, the population trends. So here's an example of a page from one of the Wildbook platforms, the one for cetaceans, whales and dolphins, called Flukebook. And this is Pinchy. She's a sperm whale. She's the most cited animal individual in that Wildbook. She really likes her picture taken, hangs out around Dominica, and been seen more than 600 times. Wildbook for whales and dolphins, the Flukebook, the one of many Wildbooks, contains more than 2 million images, actually approaching 3 million, of about 68,000 uniquely identified individuals. It is the official platform for the entire North American whale catalog of Bureau of Ocean Energy Management of the Department of Interior of US, and is increasingly used by many, many organizations. But even that doesn't bring enough data, right? Enough information to really track the global biodiversity of the world. There is a lot of information out there, a lot of pictures, a lot of images that are currently not yet used as data for biodiversity monitoring. That's all the images posted on social media. So we created a bot, an intelligent agent, that can scour publicly posted social media videos, find the ones that contain species of interest, in this case, whale shark, the largest fish on Earth, and find the frames that contain the animal, send them through the entire pipeline of image processing, and add the identified image to the appropriate page of Wildbook, in this case, Sharkbook. Once the animal has been identified, the bot generates text, posting in the comments of the video, hey, 2 minutes, 46 seconds, we found this whale shark in your video, here's everything we know about it, and people respond. They didn't even expect that their vacation video could be contributing to science and conservation, and so people get excited. The most common response that we get is, wow, this is amazing, how can I help? How can I help? Shows that we're connecting to them right where they are, right? They just posted their video, and they probably have many more images and many more videos that they have taken on that vacation, and they're eager to share them, eager to contribute now to science and conservation. And quite often they will follow the animal through the postings of others, because now it has become personal. AI has made the connection between the human and the animal that they saw, right? Not only that, but at the bottom of every page of Wildbook, we also post all the contributors of data to that individual animal. So because it's a global species, right? There's not one organization, there is not one scientific project that has information even about one individual. It is only by sharing data, only by putting those pieces of data together that we can truly create the global picture of a global species. And so just that, right, makes the connection among the people who are studying the same species, who are trying to protect the same species, like who are following the same species. And so the Shark Book, Wildbook, contains information today on more than 17,000 uniquely identified individuals. More than 13,000 of them are whale sharks. And these data are coming from more than 9,000 volunteers who directly upload their information, their images to Shark Book, about 300 scientific and conservation projects, and one very clever bot who scours social media posts. In fact, that bot, in its first year after launching, brought in more data than all the human contributors combined. And majority of that data was unique. And the individuals that were seen in those data by people who were posting their vacation videos was not reflected in the directly contributed data. So that's a huge untapped source of information, right, that we really can harness to help monitor the global biodiversity. The IUCN Red List entry for whale sharks was changed based on data from Wildbook. The conservation status of whale sharks was changed from vulnerable to endangered, and the population trend was changed from stable to decreasing, not because the species are doing worse, but because we have the right data to make the right determination that will then, because the status has changed, it means that there is a change in the resources that are being put to support the species. There's a change in policy. There's a change in the protection level that the species now can have. And hopefully there will be a change in the outcome of the global population of whale sharks. The most comprehensive study on the biology of whale sharks was published using these data from Wildbook, and was co-authored by 37 authors, most of whom met through the pages of Wildbook, through that bottom thing of here's who contributed data. So by just showing who contributed data to each individual, incentivized data sharing, and scientists on their own reached out to each other to put their data together. We didn't have to force anybody to share data. They initiated data sharing, right? AI enabled that connection. And the indicators, the metrics for population monitoring, for species monitoring, were also recently updated based on the data from Wildbook, and again, collection of people that are contributing data to this species. We have Wildbooks from more than 60 species, marine and terrestrial, spanning the entire globe. One of the newer ones are weedy and leafy sea dragons, my favorite. They're amazingly looking species who hang out around Australia. One of the newer species to the Wildbook for whales and dolphins, to Flukebook, are orcas, killer whales. And in the few months since the Wildbook was launched, there are already thousands and thousands of records that have been uploaded, together bringing enough data that we're hoping the conservation status of killer whales will be updated soon, and they will be data deficient no more. The same technology that was used to build Wildbook was also used for the first ever full census of an entire species using photographs from ordinary people. In January 2016, for 2 days, hundreds of people were driving around Kenya, taking pictures of the endangered Greve zebra. 95% of the species are in Kenya. Everybody, from school kids to park rangers and the US ambassador to Kenya and tourists with telephoto cameras, took more than 40,000 images of this amazing animal. While the technology that we have, the entire image processing pipeline, was used to identify all the animals in those pictures, the identifiable animals in those pictures, and to produce the population size estimate of about 2,300 animals, plus minus 75 or so, I think. It was so good with such tight confidence bounds that Kenya Wildlife Service decided that this is the way that they're going to monitor the species, monitor the population, and asked to do it again. In fact, asked us to do it every 2 years. So in January 2016, more people were taking more pictures, and turns out, of more zebras. The population grew. Again, the population estimate was 2,800 plus minus 150. And if you're keeping track of the arithmetic there, you'll notice that the confidence intervals are super tight. We can truly say, confidently say, that the population is growing. The event was repeated in 2020 and is held, suspended during COVID and the drought that is going on in Kenya right now. We're hoping it will be restarted. Based on that data and based on the trust in the process, because everybody participated. Kenya Wildlife Service, together with the governors of the counties that have the Greve zebras in their county, signed the proclamation putting resources, land, people, and policy to protect Greve zebras based on this process, based on this event of both getting the information, getting the data, and monitoring the state of the population, the state of the species, with respect to the policies, how well the policies are actually working. The assistant director of Kenya Wildlife Service, when the results were presented for the first time, said, "This shows the power of citizen science and machine learning for conservation." There are 3 firsts in this sentence. This is the first time that Kenya Wildlife Service was using this kind of a process to monitor a population, monitor a species. This is the first time that everybody was engaged in the process. The youngest photographer was 3 years old. And this is the first time that the words machine learning were used in a sentence, officially by Kenya Wildlife Service, as far as we know. So it's fantastic. AI was able to connect ordinary people to the wildlife, which is the treasure of the country. The IUCN Red List entry for Greve zebras was also updated based on this data and will be updated again when new numbers will come in. And so I hope that over the last about 20 minutes, I gave you a glimpse of how AI can really empower people to and extract information from photographs, right? All over, coming from different sources. But what's gold for scientists and conservation managers, unfortunately, also is very useful information for wildlife criminals. Geotagged images of animals can be used as beacons for poachers. An image of an elephant posted on social media attracted poachers to the location within hours. So by bringing together these collections of geotagged images of endangered species, we're creating risk to the very species that we're trying to protect. And so we put a lot of thought and published a white paper really as a stating the problem and a call to the thought that needs to be put in to create platforms in a way that protect the information that is hosted on platforms like this, on these collections of images. So these data sources do not lead to the extinction of the very species we're trying to protect. The other problem of using social media as a source of information about biodiversity is bias. Right? There are many, many sources of bias that come with, in general, with any data source, right? If you want to estimate the population size, then just being there at the right time at the right place to see the animals, right, is quite often a biased process, producing a biased channel of what you're actually seeing. Then if you're using images to estimate population size, the ability to take a picture or the decision to take a picture, whether it's human or an automated camera or an autonomous vehicle, to actually being able to see the picture, to take the picture or to decide to take the picture is also a source of bias. Then if we're talking about humans posting it on social media, the decision on which social media platform, what you're going to post, every step of that decision introduces bias into the process. And then each platform also has its own policies of what you can get from the platform and at what rate. And finally, which models we're going to use for population size estimate. But all we care about is that the difference between the population estimate and the original population and trying to really minimize it. So we're working, it's a frontier of research problem, trying to really get unbiased information from very, very biased sources. Something that is still very much work in progress, but has to be addressed if we want to use this source of information for making decisions that we can trust. And so to summarize, I've shown you how AI and data science can enable science, conservation, and public engagement by creating connections. Connections among data pieces, connections among people, and connecting people to data, to animals, and working in partnership, humans and machines, to create solutions that people can truly trust. And I would like to thank my colleagues who were instrumental, critical in creating, there's a whole team of creating the platform and the solutions and the research behind it, the team of WildMe that implemented all of the platform, the supporters, the many supporters who contributed in many ways, resources and finances, as well as the thousands and thousands of volunteers who collect data, annotate data, help verify it, and the most importantly, use the information coming out from the platform and other AI solutions to really protect the biodiversity of the world on the ground, in the field, every single day. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That was fantastic. If you would please take a seat up here. I'm going to introduce our panelists for the next phase of our presentation today. So next up, Professor Bernd Meyer. Bernd, if you'd come join us up here on the panel. Bernd is the Associate Dean Sustainability at the Faculty of IT at Monash, and he's also the lead for Sustainability, AI, and Data Science within the Monash Data Futures Institute. And Bernd's research in computational ecology develops mathematical and computational models for the interactions of organisms with their environment, including the impact our changing environment has on their lives. So welcome, Bernd. Our next panelist is Dr. John Cook. John, if you'll come on up, standing in front of you. John is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University. And John's research focuses on developing interdisciplinary solutions to misinformation about climate change, such as detecting misinformation claims using machine learning and using critical thinking to build public resilience. So welcome, John. Our next panelist is joining us online, Dr. Yadin Shardez. Hello, Nadine.
Hi, everyone.
Dr. Shardez is a principal research scientist with CSIRO in Australia. She's an activity leader with the Machine Learning and AI Future Science platform, where she focuses on developing artificial intelligence algorithms for decision-making and conservation, biosecurity, and epidemiology. And in particular, she's developed algorithms to increase the interpretability of AI solutions for decision-making. So thank you for joining us, Yadin, and for all of our panelists. We're going to engage now in a discussion, and then we'll open up the floor for questions later in today's session. So I'm going to kick off with the first question, Bernd, to you. And your research in computational ecology, including impact on organisms by the environment, why is AI relevant? Why use AI in this domain? And what do you see as the big opportunities?
So I think I need to slightly turn that around, because the work on how organisms interact with their environment is ultimately, again, to contribute to biodiversity, right? You worry about or wonder about how organisms interact with their environment because you want to understand when they're threatened, which ones are there, where do they move, ultimately with that purpose, right? Why is AI important? Well, it's essentially the same reasons, obviously, that were just pointed out quite powerfully, right? In that area, in general, data is scarce, extremely scarce, so much so that it's now been termed, in the literature, you find it as the biodiversity data crisis. So we actually have two things. We have the biodiversity crisis and we have a biodiversity data crisis, right? And Tanya made that point quite powerfully, but just to reiterate that a little bit, Australia just did the State of the Environment report, which is an official government report that's commissioned every 5 years in general about the state of the environment. And statement in there was, and I need to read that off so that I get it right, biodiversity overall is monitored very poorly in Australia, and we cannot assess the state and trend of most species with any confidence, right? Data scarcity, data deficient. And yeah, clearly AI has a lot to contribute. Tanya made the point powerfully, the data collection. And it also goes beyond images. So anything data that you get in via remote sensing, autonomous sensor networks. In our case, we work a lot with acoustic data on the environment. All of that needs to be interpreted ultimately, right? And interpretation currently is mostly done by humans. So the bottleneck for all of that is really human labor, which is not only extremely costly, but also really takes a lot of time, right? And we don't have either. We don't have the time and we don't have the resources. So that's the main thing. Ultimately, conservation decisions need to be made because resources are so scarce quite efficiently and optimally in some sense. And without the data, that's just really not possible. So to connect that a little bit further, just to go beyond pure data collection, I mean, we get a lot more data, but probably still not enough in that sense. And I think that's the important part. AI can also kick in other phases. And so one of the phases that relates quite closely to our work is in sort of a modeling phase where you make more sense out of the data, so to speak. And traditionally, many of these things are done in a statistical way where you need lots of data, but you can also build models that incorporate more first principles knowledge. So for example, behavior of animals that we have, you can do that in various ways. So you build models that combine causal knowledge in a broad sense together with the statistical knowledge. And the beauty of that is that so in some sense, AI-based model. And the beauty of that is that they can then cope with less data, actually. They make better predictions with less data, right? And so that's the second part where that really kicks in. And then you can further think up the data chain, obviously. So acquiring data, making sense of it, interpreting it. And then the next stages are obviously you want to do something with the data, which is ultimately decision making, again in a higher domain, and then obviously communicate it. But I think Yadin and John are the experts on those stages.
Yeah, thanks, Bernd. And we're going to come back to this discussion about data as we go through this panel discussion. So thank you. Yadin, I'm going to turn to you next with a question. Obviously, your research is at the forefront of linking conservation science with quantitative tools. And so from your perspective in the world of conservation, what do you see as the opportunities for AI, right? What's exciting? What are the big things ahead of us?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So from my perspective, where I've been working on helping people make decisions for managing species in the best way possible. And as we mentioned, we have very poor data to work with. And so it becomes a problem where we don't know exactly what the future will be, and we don't know exactly how species are doing. And that's where AI can actually help us a lot. So the same technology that is helping us driving autonomously cars and robots can actually be used in conservation to help managers making decisions about what threat to manage, where and when, and also learn as fast as possible. So that's very important because our resources are limited. We can't really afford to waste any time, so we want to go as fast as possible. So to me, that's the opportunity. And of course, it's quite different in some ways because there are new constraints working with species and people. We have to be very careful about the AI technology we are developing. So for me, the future is all about helping conservation managers around the world adopting this AI technology to help them make better decisions for conservation.
Thanks, Yadin. Fascinating work. John, your background's a little different. Your focus is actually around understanding how information is used or misused, particularly in the context of climate change. And so as you think about the world that you're in around communications, what are the opportunities for AI, particularly in the context of misinformation?
Can everyone hear me? So in my field, in misinformation, there's a saying that we all use: misinformation can get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants. So the challenge is, by the time the misinformation has been noticed and fact checkers have worked and investigated and worked out a fact check, a debunking, it's already done its damage. So in the misinformation research community, we have what we call the holy grail of fact checking, which is automatically detecting and fact-checking misinformation in real time. Rather than letting it get halfway around the world, fact-check it as soon as it appears. It's called the Holy Grail for a reason. It's really difficult to do. My area is climate misinformation, and there's a unique opportunity there in that the arguments that we hear from climate deniers in 2022 are the same arguments we were hearing in the early 1990s. It's not happening, or it's not human cause, or the science is too uncertain, or climate action will harm the economy, or it costs too much. It's those same arguments. We've been hearing them for like 30 plus years now. And that means that it's possible to use machine learning to actually detect climate misinformation. By taking historical examples of misinformation, we just, through manual supervised learning, just training over and over and over again, we were able to train the machine to detect all the different types of climate misinformation so that it is able to detect it in real time. And so now we're looking at content as it comes online, and we can immediately identify misinformation. And the funny thing is, it's not just the old arguments. Like sometimes new arguments come, and they're really just recycled versions of old arguments. Ironically, climate deniers are very good recyclers when it comes to misinformation. An example is one really popular argument in the last decade has been that global warming stopped in 1998 because it was an unusually hot year, and then there was sort of flat temperatures. Then in 2014, 2015, 2016, it got really hot again, and that argument just dropped off a cliff. They stopped using it. That's one thing that our machine learning research found. But now the machine is detecting that same argument again, but it's shifted. It's saying global warming stopped in 2016, and the argument is kind of making a comeback again. Because it's the same pattern, our machine was able to detect it.
Thanks, John. So Tanya, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation. Obviously, we've already heard a lot from you around what the opportunity space is for AI with the ways that you've been using the technology already. But as you think about the future, what do you think we need to be doing differently? And what are the opportunities that AI could enable as we think about this broader conservation question?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And as every speaker mentioned so far, the problem is so big and so urgent that we really need to do something now. And one of the hopes of AI technology is that it can scale the solutions, scale the approaches across time, space, and individual organisms, while at the same time increasing the resolution of our sort of attention. On the opportunities and challenges of using AI in biodiversity, there's a report that just came out yesterday, in fact, by the Global Partnership on AI that really outlines the entire range of opportunities at every stage, from kind of getting the basic data to creating metrics for biodiversity monitoring, to making predictions about populations and species dynamics, and using AI to understand the complexities of interactions among species in different habitats with yet unseen factors that affect biodiversity. Many of them are human-induced, but there's various aspects of human-induced, right? There's the habitat alteration, habitat loss. There's the interactions with humans and encroachment of humans into the wild habitats. There's the climate change effect, and there's the wildlife crime. So there's a lot of different parts to this problem, and so AI can really start helping putting together these complex interactions into one very complex system. It is a wicked problem, right? And just like humans have to work together, many humans have to work together to bring their different perspectives into one system level understanding of this very, very complex issue. Similarly, AI can be one of the partners in this in this process.
Thanks, Tanya. Yadin, I'd like to come back to you, because this notion of the role of the human in AI and decision making, I think, is very important. And I know, Yadin, you've been looking at how do we make some of these decisions and trade-offs with perhaps imperfect data sets. So I wondered if you'd like to comment around the opportunity for how do we do more with less data in the context of conservation?
Yeah, that's exactly what our challenge is about. It's so from a conservation perspective, collecting data can be very expensive. So we need to make the best out of this data. We can guide the data collection so that we collect the data where it matters the most. And when we try to protect species or save species, we want to collect that data so that at the end, our data persistence increases. Where the challenge we have using traditional AI algorithm is these AI algorithms often have been devised in an autonomous way. So they've been devised to be embedded in an autonomous robot or autonomous agent. When we work in conservation, we work with people. So we have to listen to, account for their expertise, include that expertise into our models or AI. And then we have to provide actually solutions that they can be interpreted. And that's very challenging, because the problems we're trying to solve are as complex as driving autonomous cars. but what we're trying to do now is protect more species. So what is required for people to implement the decision that the AI would recommend is actually understand why these decisions should be implemented. So we have to turn this black box algorithm into something that is a white box. So we can really interpret and understand the knowledge behind the solutions. So that's a very important trade-off, and that means, unfortunately, that the cost of having solutions that are interpretable also often means that we can't be as optimal as if we were in charge of driving an autonomous car, for example. So we have to trade off interpretability of the solutions with some kind of performance, basically. So, but that's where it is working very well, and people are engaged, and it's a very active area of research. So I'm very hopeful that more people will actually contribute to making AI algorithms more interpretable into the future.
Great, thank you. I'd like to circle back to the conversation that we started with around data. We saw lots of images at the beginning. Bernd, you've talked about data. We've talked about not having enough data. Bernd, I wondered if you could comment around what you see as some of the challenges and risks in the way that we think about data for conservation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So challenges. So one thing is probably that we don't know terribly well at this point where we actually want more data. So we know we have very, very little data, but and it's also very clear that we can't collect all the data that we would like to have. And so there's a bit of a risk in just running frantically around and gathering more data. But luckily, that's actually something that AI potentially can help you with as well, through things like value of information theory and so on, to actually say, where does data actually really give me in terms of information that later supports my decision making and so on. So it's a challenge, but there's also some sort of at least roots of a solution lurking in the background of that.
Yeah, great. Great, thanks. And John, the type of data that you're probably looking for as you think about climate misinformation is probably different from looking at pictures of zebras. So as you think about data, what are some of the challenges or risks that you see in the climate and misinformation space? And do you have enough data? Do you need more data? What are your views on data as it relates to misinformation?
Yeah, in misinformation, we don't have a deficiency of data. We have a surplus. So, in fact, our job is to try to get to a deficiency level. But, so with us, there's lots of challenges. One is that misinformation in different sources takes different forms. Like we trained our machine on blogs and conservative think tank websites, which were the most prolific sources of misinformation. Then we find that our model struggles when you start trying to use it to detect misinformation on Twitter. It's kind of like trying to get your grandfather to understand Twitter. It's like, what's with all these hashtags and weird language? So we're finding that we're almost having to train our model to cope with different formats. I think the other challenge is, in a sense, the AI problem, the detecting the misinformation, is almost the easy bit. The hard bit is then interfacing that with the rest of the solution to misinformation, which is connecting it to critical thinking, fact-checking type steps to identify what is misinformation and what isn't, connecting it to psychological research into how do you debunk misinformation in an effective way, because that's a communication problem. And there's a whole bunch of cultural complexities and social complexities in terms of when you debunk misinformation that threatens a person's cultural or social identity, it can be ineffective or even counterproductive. And then how do you deploy your interventions out to reach the communities that most need it, that are most vulnerable to misinformation? So I think that's probably the biggest challenge, is just connecting all these different moving parts.
Thanks, John. Tanya, one of the things I know you've talked about is do no harm. And so in the context of misinformation, how does that theme of do no harm and protecting the data that you need in order to both do good at the same time that you do no harm, what are some of the challenges that you see around this notion of protecting the data for conservation to enable us to do no harm?
Great question. And, you know, it's interesting that the theme there that is both Yadin and here it has been kind of that it is the very in creating, deploying, and using AI solutions for biodiversity conservation and for climate change, to combat climate change, is very small. AI itself is a very small part of it, right? The big part of it is human behavior. It's the humans, right? We need to make sure that the solutions that while identifying the misinformation, the data that we want to remove, that it is actionable, right? That we can actually remove it, that we can actually deploy these solutions, that we can actually convince people to do something about it, to think differently, to act differently. Similarly, in the whole aspect of biodiversity conservation and even just monitoring biodiversity, the solutions, we can create the most accurate algorithms that we can test on benchmark data. They will be absolutely useless if people are not using them, if people do not trust the data that's coming out of it, or if we inadvertently disclose some information about the endangered species. So the biggest aspect of creating AI solutions in this and many other fields is engendering trust in this. And the process of engendering trust is not about creating better AI solutions. It's about creating solutions with those whom they benefit, not for them. It's engaging everybody in the process of stating the problem, identifying the problems, creating the solution that works for people, and then making sure that people can use it, and really finding that point of partnership between AI and a human. And while doing this, also not being so in love with AI that we create these solutions purely for the sake of creating yet better solution, where it barely improves or not at all on the action that is being taken in the field, the actions that people actually take. Right? If the entire AI pipeline does not change the conservation policy, no amount of improved solutions, did not change the conservation policy. Not only we shouldn't bother, it's actually unethical to bother, because AI consumes enormous amount of resources. It consumes, the computational hardware uses rare metals, the energy, the water, and the CO2 footprint that's resulting from all of this is not, is creating so much harm if we're not improving. The trade-off is not improving anything for conservation. Then not only why bother, we shouldn't do it. And so we really need to think sort of this trade-off of do no harm. Is what we're doing actually better? Is it actually going to be used?
Thanks. Yadin, I know that you've been involved in some of these discussions around the trade-offs. Would you like to comment at all on Tanya's point here around how to do no harm?
Yeah, that's Tanya. That's exactly what we need to do. So with the CSIRO, we work a lot with managers on the ground, and we try our best to actually co-develop these algorithms, which is not an easy thing because it requires some prior knowledge. So there's some interesting work that can be done around how to best engage and how to best communicate about what the tools can do, this AI tools can do, and what they cannot do. And there's a lot of requirement for establishing that trust. So co-developing is key in that. What we found is it does take about, there's several years to actually show the value of using AI algorithms, and then there's more time is required to actually test them and make sure we don't make any harms. An issue that appears when we use AI for decision making is we're providing guidance to make decision effectively. So we have to be very careful that we don't include any biases, and that's a massive issue in conservation, because by using these AI algorithms that are very smart and try to optimize some kind of objective, we may be losing some context. So typically, threatened species cannot have actions that say do not do anything. And if we don't prevent algorithms to have this type of actions, they will choose do nothing as their first action they recommend. So it's a type of bias that we've discovered recently, and it just shows that we need to be very careful. So always include humans in the loop, always include managers to check with us and improve our algorithms over time. Yeah.
Thanks, Yadin. So we've talked a lot about tracking species and understanding the dynamics of species in the context of conservation. But Bernd, I know that you've also been working around tracking invasive species as well. And clearly invasive species do harm. But in the context of this broader conversation around AI and the ability to track, I know you've been involved in some work here in Australia around a particular invasive species. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on sort of preserving a population, but also identifying some of the threats to that population with invasive species.
Yeah, so correct. We've been working a lot specifically with cane toads because they're a prototypical example system in model system in Australia. Look, in the context of biodiversity, invasive species are important because they're actually one of the main contributors to the loss of biodiversity. So in Asia Pacific, it's about 15% of biodiversity loss that is simply can be attributed to invasive species. That's a pretty massive component, and actually it's a larger component than climate change. Right, so the main threats actually to biodiversity are first and foremost land use, right? Then of course pollution, invasive species, and then climate change is important, but it's actually not the biggest thing. And so, yeah, we're trying to track that. Were the models that I was talking about earlier that we're trying to make more powerful with less data at the same time, collecting more data. To determine how these invasive species move because of the impact that they have on native populations, displacing them, and so on and so forth. Right. So that's, you need to understand these interactions, which again also probably comes back to the modeling point, because the interactions between different species can also drive the modeling of how invasive species move.
Great. To our audience, we're almost ready to switch into a question and answer session for this discussion. So please add your questions in through the webinar, or for those of you in the room through Slido. But before we get to questions, John, I have another question for you. And it's related to this notion of communication. So my question is around, how should we be interacting more broadly across other disciplines? Psychology, critical thinking, communication, and the role of the individual in all of us in terms of how we interact.
So as in, how should IT and computer scientists be interacting with other disciplines to solve these problems?
Yes, and the role, as we think about this human in the loop conversation, we're often working with conservation managers. They're not necessarily IT professionals. But how do we enable that conversation around the future opportunities to continue?
Yeah, so full disclosure, my discipline is psychology. So I'm coming at it as the psychologist who found that I needed to work with computer scientists to come up with AI solutions. So just in case anyone.
We're humans.
And so and the reason I had to do that was because I was trying to develop solutions to problems and found that these are complicated problems that need interdisciplinary solutions. So I had to start working with people outside of my own discipline, computer scientists, philosophers, critical thinkers, and it's really hard. Like interdisciplinarity is really difficult because I find that we all speak different languages, especially philosophers who live on another planet to the rest of us. And not only different vocabularies, often just completely different ways of thinking. And so there's a big learning curve in starting these kind of collaborations, but once you get them working, they're incredibly rewarding and powerful. And we're able to develop these solutions that tackle complicated problems that you can't tackle from a single discipline. So I, as a psychologist coming at it from a different angle, I found that I couldn't solve the problems I needed to solve without bringing in those other disciplines.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move now to taking some questions from the audience. And we've got obviously an audience in the room here, but also an audience online. And so I'm going to try and curate the questions from my phone here, and we'll have a good conversation, I'm sure. So one of the questions that's come in is around different ways that we can use computer vision for different types of species. And so this is maybe a question for both Tanya and Bernd. Do you see computer vision being useful for insect conservation, or is it too difficult?
It is useful for insect conservation. There are examples now with butterflies, and so it depends also at which level. You know, iNaturalist is a platform of citizen science that enables anybody actually in the world, now I'm doing the plug for them as well, is just to take a picture and report an observation, and machine learning computer vision allows you to get to the level of, from a picture, what species it is. So that allows people all over the world to track the status of biodiversity across the entire, range of species. And insects are one of the, after birds and plants, are the next collection of species are insects that are reported more than any other ones on iNaturalist. Yeah, but if you look on any social media, birds are the majority of pictures out there. There's another citizen science platform specifically for birds, eBird. But back to insects, yes, absolutely. In fact, there are efforts to track mosquito disease spreading, mosquito-borne disease spreading through reporting of mosquitoes through sound and computer vision. There is the tracking the monarch butterfly migrations through computer vision. A lot of those involve very much sort of crowdsourced and citizen science and community engaged science, because you need lots of pictures. And what AI enables is non-experts to contribute instantly to a lot of these efforts.
The mosquito sound website must be a very annoying one to listen to.
But then when you know that you're doing something about it, maybe it gives you a little bit more satisfaction, right?
And another question, again, it's related to images, and for all of you, please feel free to chime in and answer the question. But the question's actually around, how do we defend against synthetic images that are generated by perhaps nefarious models or even normal models, but models such as DALL-E? And is that a challenge? Are we seeing nefarious images being created to distort the data sets that we're trying to use?
Yeah, great question. Luckily, not yet. But so if you've used any of the online platforms to generate images like DALL-E, to generate images of animals, they're not that great yet. Not only that, but they also embed information in the image itself that make it obvious that it is a computer generated image. So but clearly it's coming. Clearly, these programs are going to be good enough, and there will be people who will not use the official source to generate images, but could generate others. So then it's a little bit of a race. Can we keep up with ahead of the nefarious use, and dream up what would be the risk in generating synthetic data? What synthetic data what bad synthetic data would look like? So one hope is that many of the very features, the very traits that allow us to identify animals, right? They're essentially walking watermarks. They are identifying themselves. And so if you get new synthetically generated images, then depending on the information that they're contributing synthetically, right, it can skew in different ways the data that you're getting. And so we just certainly are spending enough time thinking about that kind of misinformation, right?
So I would actually think that's exactly one of the problems to which our earlier comment on you need to take the humans into consideration applies. We can think about lots of technological solutions to that, right? As Tanya's just elaborated on, but ultimately, as you also said, that is going to end up in an arms race, right? No one can ever win an arms race, ultimately. Yeah. So that, but I mean, there are a bunch of questions. One question is, first question is actually, why would anyone do that? Because they don't have to gain from it, right? So that's probably the first thing that you want to ensure, that people don't have to gain from such attacks, right? But whatever the exact answer is, it seems like that is probably best combated by thinking about, well, why people would do it on a more general sense of taking people into consideration and going at it from that angle rather than just looking for technological answers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yadin, I'm conscious that it's hard for you to participate while you're not sitting on the couch with us here, but there's a question here that again relates back to data that may be relevant for you. So how do you define the amount of data required to see, in essence, what species are in a forest, as an example, or to understand the extinction of a species due to invasive species? And I know you've been looking at some particular conservation threatened species here in Australia. So interested in your view around how do we survey the environment that a species is in, or in fact determine what species exist within an ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a very good. Yeah, that's a very good question. So the questions I looked at when it was about how can we determine if a species is still present or absent, is it locally extinct, and are we wasting our time managing that population, or should we actually move our resources and go to a different population? It was the type of problems we got to solve using AI. And we did that, accounting for the amount of effort that was going on for surveillance. So they were using camera traps, and we knew approximately where, the grid, like what was our surveillance effort. And therefore, if we were to observe a species such in that case that was the Sumatran tiger, we would know, we would have an estimate of whether or not the local population would be extant or extinct. And so that information then was used to inform the type of investment that was needed for that particular population. So it really is a case-by-case type of problem. We can't, from my perspective, like it depends the type of surveillance that is accessible. It could be that is available in the country. Sometimes it's a very citizen science type of surveillance. We have to use different type of statistics, and then sometimes it's camera trap, sometimes it's remote sensing. So depending on technology, we have to come up with some kind of estimates of how good we are at detecting whether or not a species is there or not. And once we have this information, then we can either use the AI to guide more surveillance if it's required, if there's a value in actually gathering more information, or if we should actually invest these resources somewhere else, or actively managing threats. Because sometimes we don't need to know more. If we know that the local population is extinct, then we should really investing in abatement of threats rather than continuing monitoring. So yeah, these trade-offs are useful. I'm not so much an expert into discovering other type of species. I would say that technologies such as soundscape or remote sensing or all of these other technologies would be very useful, but it's not the type of technology that I've been using or working on. Maybe someone else can comment on that.
We can probably pick up the point on soundscapes because I think it's very interesting in particular regard. So we tend to think about these biodiversity assessments of areas and so on, and thinking about specific species or a set of species and counting them, how many of them are there, and so on and so forth, as a very kind of targeted direct assessment. But there are other forms, and some of these actually come out of AI work. So soundscapes are one of them, where you just do a holistic assessment. So you measure, for example, just, what does the whole environment there sound like, but not in a form that you could attribute to any particular species, any particular interaction, and so on and so forth. And that becomes increasingly used actually as indicators of biodiversity and how sites actually change. So for example, one interesting piece of research recently come out of Bristol is assessing reef health on that basis, right? Where you just go, look at the whole soundscape of the reef holistically, and based on that, I can, without thinking about particular species or anything, I can think about how healthy that reef is. It turns out to work surprisingly well.
Great. Thank you. There's another question here, and I'm not sure which one of you wants to address it, so I'll ask the question, but each one of you can take a stab at answering this one. And it's really around the way I think it's around the way that we tell the story of what we're doing in conservation. So predicting population declines are insightful and needed, right? And that's a lot of what we've been doing. But do we have examples of stories where we've understood, leveraging AI, the cause of population decline? And therefore, if we understand the cause, do we have examples of how we can address the decline based on the knowledge that we've gained through the data and AI analysis? So obviously, Tanya, you've been monitoring populations. We heard that from the population work in Kenya. So counting is good, but being able to understand the numbers and the cause for decline. Do we have stories there or experiences from the work that all of you have been doing?
I can have a go. So in my work, we are trying to find the best management action to abate the threats to species. And so we have to understand that understanding the cause takes a long time, requires a lot of data. And it's a race, and often we do have knowledge about what the causes could be. There's usually 3 or 4 options. We might not know which one it is, but we know there's a limited amount of threats that could actually cause a decline. What we're doing instead, because we don't have a lot of time and it's an urgent decision-making problem, is we work on the management actions. So we work on the management that can be done. And what we're doing is trying to find out as fast as possible which management of threats is actually the most efficient for the species. And if the species respond positively, then we found a way of protecting that species as fast as possible. So it's not necessarily finding exactly what the causal links are, it's finding what is the best management actions to recover that species or that local population at a stage, which we kind of, we streamline the collection of data just for the purpose of actually acting and removing the threat from the system, which managers prefer because it's often too difficult to actually know exactly the cause of a decline.
To add to this, great point, Edin, that causal AI is not great in general at causal inference. In fact, most AI methods are particularly good at finding correlation patterns, but detangling the cause, humans are not great at that quite often, right? So, and it takes even more effort for AI, and we probably wouldn't trust it anyway, because it would take a lot of, verification before we can trust, yeah, this is the cause. But there is, as Aiden pointed out, there is a lot of knowledge from expert of what could be the cause, and it is much more important. So that typically is not the biggest question, but the management aspect. To amplify and give another example of how AI can help assess the impact of different management actions and choose the ones that work in different contexts. Going back to the example of the Grevy's zebras in Kenya, there are different policies that were put in place and were possible for different counties that have the endangered species. Some could allocate protected land, some couldn't, because it was mixed use land, so they could put more resources, policies in protecting the parts of the land, or control the mixed use and allocation of resources. And in one county, for example, they're doing such a great job with lion conservation that there are too many predators per prey, which include zebras. So the management policy there was contraception for lions, for the predators, to put the predator and prey in balance. So there are different actions, right? And there are different causes there for population decline in different places, but the actions to mitigate it, after they were put in place, you could assess it much, much faster, the impact of those actions, than figuring out the causes in the first place.
So there's a related question around, monitoring decline of species, so the question, it's related, but the question is, how can we use AI to see if management actions, Yadin, you mentioned conservation actions, but can we use AI to see if management actions are creating a positive or negative biodiversity delta over time? How do we measure that?
So I'll start, maybe. Yadin, maybe we'll tag team on this one as well.
You start.
So conservation metrics is one of the, it's a big debate of what should be conservation metrics. What should we be monitoring in the first place? What are the good indicators of the population health? So IUCN Red List, Species Commission has the global conservation metrics that are used to assess the conservation status of every species, and the Species Commission for every species is using them to determine, which also require a lot of data. And so, but that's at the very global levels. More locally, there's the not only these conservation metrics such as the global population size or population size, the population trend, and the percent of juveniles, for example, to the reproductive rate, and many other things. Not only locally, they're maybe difficult to, much more at the much more finer grade, difficult to monitor, but it also, there are other metrics that come into account. And so there's a lot of debate of what are the conservation metrics in the first place. But a lot of the quantitative ones, right, and not all of them are quantifiable, or at least not all of them are quantified currently. But those that are quantified and those that are quantifiable, that's actually what AI is doing best, can do best. Anything that is quantifiable, where you can use data to produce these numbers, AI can really scale and accelerate the getting up to that number and assessing that number. And that's what I think the biggest strength of AI is, once you know which metrics you're interested in, really using those to monitor the impact of the policies.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm just I'll add just a small thing. I'm also confronted to actually having these metrics to measure progress. Like, it's really hard, and so also it's often difficult to have this information, quantitative information. So what we did instead is use some qualitative assessment from experts. And when we think about it, every time we try to manage a population, we're testing whether it's there's three type of futures. Either it's working, so we're seeing an increase, so it's good news. Either we're not seeing anything, we can't really tell, and which stays the same, we can't tell, or there's a decline. And so when we think about it, just having these three types of information, we can already do a lot. So if managers are able to give us this information, we can actually help them learn and pick the next management action and potentially improve the status of a species over time. So that's also very powerful. That's something that AI can do quite well.
Thank you both. Thank you. John, I'm going to come back to this notion of misinformation, but frame the context in a slightly different way. I mean, we see a tremendous amount of misinformation that is distributed on social media and on a number of different social media platforms. It might be misinformation about an election, misinformation about climate that we've been talking about. But do you see this threat of misinformation and how to identify it as also a threat when we're having this conversation around AI for conservation? Where could misinformation be a challenge for us as we think about the conversations that go on in the media and what is or is not said about conservation? Is that a concern that we should think about? And if so, how do we leverage the kind of expertise that you've been involved in to think about the impact for conservation?
So we were talking earlier about causal effects and like drivers. And in the case of misinformation, like two of the big drivers that can make misinformation become a really significant societal problem is when vested interests are motivated to promote misinformation or when ideology is motivated. In my case, in the case of climate change, it's political ideology. So if there are cases where vested interests can profit from using misinformation to hinder AI efforts for conservation or ideological motivations, then that's where it could be a problem. To be honest, it's outside my lane, so I don't know whether there are such movements involved. But that in the case of climate change, both of those are present and amplifying each other. And that's why climate misinformation has become one of the biggest, I think, societal threats or misinformation campaigns in history.
Great. Did you want to add something, Bernd?
Yeah, I think we're kind of limiting ourselves if we only think about misinformation as a particularly important thing, and particularly with climate, really important. I don't think, not the expert, but I don't think it has happened as much yet with biodiversity, but that's probably because biodiversity is not yet at the forefront of the discussion as much as climate. The moment it is, and it's starting to be there, and the moment the vested interests are in play, and they will be, right, we'll probably get the same. But there's also a positive side, right, and that is the value of having information there in the first place, which we didn't. Or didn't have for a long time, right? So someone was asking about insects before, and we've suffered that's actually less biodiversity than what we call bioabundance, right? They're basically just disappearing. And that wasn't even a topic until quite recently, when certain types of data actually became available. So I think we should ask those questions about communication really in two different forms, namely about misinformation, but also about lack of information, and how should information in a positive sense be brought out and be placed in order to engage people with these topics.
Yeah, and to add maybe to this, we've talked a lot about biodiversity and we've focused mostly on animals, but plant biodiversity is a huge deal. And
not as cute.
Some people would disagree. Some plants are very cute, but there is a lot of vested interest, because a lot of and to some extent in animals, but a lot more in plants, there is it runs into the agriculture and agricultural interests, and sort of using the same land for monoculture, for the interaction between species plant species becomes, very geospatially constrained, and when land is being used for agriculture and other uses, then the biodiversity of native species, it drops, and it's actually harder to bring it back. And so that's where quite a bit of misinformation also comes in. Look, there is this green area. Well, what is the biodiversity index of that area, right? So if it's all same species, it's not of the same value. And so the conversation, whether you call it misinformation or information kind of fight, or data fight, and is about not only the quantity but the quality in this case. It's just one example.
Thanks. Well, we are almost out of time. This has really been a tremendous discussion, but I'm going to ask each one of you in maybe 10-second soundbite, if you were to think about the conversation we've been having today, and to think about, is there one thing that you would take away from this that we collectively should think about? What would we do differently in 2023, or what would we keep doing the same? So I'm going to go just around the room quickly here. Tanya, what would you do differently, or what would you do the same?
The answer to both of them is to put a lot more thought, intentional thought, of where the complementary partnership of AI and humans is, with that they do no harm. Where can we do good without doing harm in the trade-off?
Great, thank you. Bernd.
I think one of the really important points that stood out for me is that we all seem to actually agree that you need to treat the whole process. You need and include the humans, the people who benefit, or probably the opposite, in the whole process, not just focus on technologies. I think that's a really important part. And that's probably for me the most important part.
Keeping the humans engaged and part of the process. Yeah. John, how about you?
A very specific thing for 2023 for me will be, in my area, there's a lot of people reinventing the wheel. And this is a data challenge as well. Like we're all collecting kind of the same data set. So my goal is to try to kind of work on centralizing that and everyone collaborating and working together more, rather than or everyone building their own little kingdoms, I think.
Great, thanks. And Yadin?
Yeah, so I would agree with everything that has been said, but maybe something that hasn't been said yet is actually training more machine learning and AI people to join the effort that we're putting into contributing to conservation. There's not enough of us. We need more people with a lot of this knowledge. So yeah, come and join us.
Fantastic.
Great, thank you. And there was one comment in the questions was around stories, right? Can we use AI to tell stories of what we're seeing? And so part of this discussion today, I think, has helped us to tell some of those stories around AI and conservation. And I think we have to tell these stories more and talk about the opportunities ahead of us. And so as I think about the future, it is about continuing this conversation around the opportunities of AI and data science as it relates to threatened ecosystems, protection of species, and actually leveraging the opportunity to not just do no harm, but to do good through the technologies that we can bring together. So thank you, panelists, for a very engaging conversation and for joining us today. We're wrapping up now after this really enthralling discussion. And in addition to thanking John and Bernd and Tanya and Yadin, I'd also like to thank the Monash Data Futures Institute team that has worked so hard to put this session together, Claudia and Vijay and Georgia, who have really done a tremendous amount of work in partnership with the ITU AI for Good team to bring this session together. So thank you. A big thank you to our audience. A big thank you to our audience online around the world, and our audience here in the room at Monash University in Australia. Thank you all for joining us. The AI for Good ITU team has been putting together a tremendous program of events over the last 2 years, all year online, and it's been a tremendous program. And we're really looking forward to 2023 to an exciting series of events, including the opportunity for a face-to-face AI for Good session in Geneva next July. So we really hope to be continuing this conversation and participating in a broader series of events in partnership with the ITU AI for Good Summit. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us today. This will conclude today's session, and I'm now going to hand back to ITU for the formal close of proceedings today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.